TownTalks is a project of the Westminster Town Hall Forum designed to engage the community in conversation and reflection on the key issues of our day from a just and equitable perspective. Our topic tonight is policing and police reform, reimagining public safety. We have invited local leaders from different areas of interest and activity in our community to explore the impact of current practices and potential changes to policing in Minnesota. Our panelists include tonight Mauri Friestleben, principal of North High School in Minneapolis and the former principal of Lucy Laney Community School. Reverend Albert Gallmon Jr., senior pastor of Fellowship Missionary Baptist Church in North Minneapolis and an adjunct professor at United Theological Seminary in St. Paul. Terrein Gill, entrepreneur and fellow at All Square, a restaurant and training center which employs, educates, and empowers people affected by the criminal justice system. Gloria Perez, president and CEO of the Women's Foundation of Minnesota and an expert on two-generational strategies for reducing poverty. And Melvin, Tennant, president and CEO of Meet Minneapolis, the Convention and Visitors Association, which promotes the Minneapolis community, the convention site and visitor destination. Gloria Perez has agreed to moderate as well as participate in the discussion this evening. We invite you to join us for our next Town Talks on Thursday, August 6th at 7 p.m. when a new panel of local leaders will explore the issue of racial trauma and mental health. If you find Town Talks informative and enriching, we welcome and need your financial support. Donations can be made on the Town Hall Forum's website at westminsterforum.org. Finally, I'd like to extend our sincere thanks to the panelists for participating in tonight's discussion. We look forward to hearing from each of them. And now, I'll turn the program over to Gloria Perez.
Thank you, Melanie, and how wonderful to be with you all. Thank you for making time out of your evening to have this really important conversation, one that I think is happening probably in neighborhoods and in living rooms on Zoom all across the country. And I think for us in particular, one of the things I'm really excited about tonight is the different perspectives that we all bring and my opportunity, frankly, to interact with each of you in a unique way. As I was thinking about reimagining public safety, I mean, this is such a big issue, right? I'd love to hear maybe from each of you or whoever wants to start about what your personal experience has been with policing, and that will be helpful as we think about how we want to reimagine it. So who'd like to start?
Gloria, I'll start. I was born in 1952 in Tampa, Florida, in the South. I was taught to fear the police, especially white police officers. I was taught that very few individuals would have as much discretionary power over me as a police officer has. And so was taught to react to police in a certain way. Growing up, that's all I knew is to fear the police.
When you talk about being taught that, was it an explicit teaching, or was that like you and your friends would talk about that, or would family members talk to you about it?
Your father and your mother taught you about that.
Okay.
Whenever you went out, you're going out at night, especially driving, you were taught that. If you were taking a trip, if we were driving from Tampa to New York City to visit my uncle, we had talks about how to act as we stopped at gas stations all along the South, and especially if you were stopped by the police.
Thank you for saying a little more about that. I actually grew up in San Antonio, Texas, and my dad died when I was 10, and I was raised by my mom. And the reason I was asking how explicit that was is because we talked about our own safety and how to act when you're in public, like to not draw attention to yourself, and it was never explicitly explained that we would be putting ourselves in danger, but as I grew older, I definitely knew that that was the message. So as I think about kids, Mauri, how are you thinking parents and kids are talking about this here in Minneapolis?
I think it's an interesting discussion and conversation. We all have had different experiences. I'm a local girl. I'm from here. You know, I can't share that same reality. I'm a woman, and I'm very light-skinned. So I'm the daughter of a black man, and I'm the sister of black men, but I'm not a black male. I know that conversation has happened in my family, but it wasn't a conversation that needed to happen with me. I think as far as the community that I call home, the city of Minneapolis, I think that there's a very diverse conversation happening right now about policing. I do think that it's a revealing time, and I welcome the revelation. I think that there are people having conversations about things that so many people have known for years. And now we're having an open conversation about things that used to only happen behind closed doors. This is evidence of that. I think that based on my experiences going, I'm most familiar with going between the black and the white world. I will be very clear about that. But the conversations are now starting to sound more alike than they've ever sounded before. And so I welcome the opportunity. I think, you know, even tonight and the priming, you know, that you gave us for this, that this is an opportunity for us to really grapple with a big issue, that this isn't necessarily a problem-solving moment, but this is a time for us to put some things on the table and to maybe be upfront about things we haven't been upfront about before.
It's so interesting that you say it's not a problem-solving moment. I think that, you know, again, being a transplant to Minnesota and having grown up in a monolingual Spanish-speaking initially, you know, family, what I often thought is that you had to be very solution, you know, oriented, right? And so if there's a problem, and I think that's a little bit of the way in which we've approached our lives, like the problem, fix it, you know, the medical model as they talk about, right? This is not the time for that. This is the time to really reckon, as they say, with the issue. So thank you.
I would agree with what you just said, Gloria, because if you try to solve too quickly, you're going to miss some things. I think there's healing that needs to take place in the community, and I believe there's still an absence of trust. We've had these conversations before, whether it's about general racism or about police reform, and maybe those conversations haven't really yielded what people have expected. So I would say that taking the time to really listen and like you said, everything is on the table. If we can really honestly admit that there's a problem, then perhaps once we get through some healing and building the trust, then I believe solutions can come. But you're exactly right. We can't move too quickly.
Terrein, are you a transplant to Minnesota, or did you grow up here?
I grew up here.
Okay.
I grew up here. And so on that note, I think we got to understand what healing looks like and be able to describe it so we can start healing the community. I think a lot of young people are hurt. And they grew up in the schools and writing reports on the civil rights and different things like that. And now it's happening in their own eyes. And they see it, this is like round two. So they're like, how can we go through this again and not have our voices heard like it was with our grandparents and people that came before us? So I think they're coming about it a little differently, but I understand, you know, how their approach, and I understand their feeling. So,
when you think about how we can build equity, how does the role of entrepreneurship fit into that?
Well, being financially secure is very important. Having black wealth, if you look at North Carolina and Atlanta and other predominantly black cities, and you know, they have a model set up that young people can look up to. They see black cops, they see black mayors, they see black EMT, black doctors. It's everywhere they go. for some reason, Minnesota does a very good job at walling that off. We have it here, but it's spread out. It's not as dense as it should be. Mm-hmm. So to have that model, or to have that young person, that role model for a young person to look up to, is not as prominent as it should be.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I hear that. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the role of hope in what we're talking about is really critical.
Yeah.
And I was talking with a friend recently about the difference between like hope and faith. Mm-hmm. And well, Reverend Gallmon, maybe you could say a little bit about that. But I do think that is one of the challenges that we've been experiencing lately as individuals and as communities is how can we have faith that things will change? Perhaps the fact that these conversations are happening in more communities is one of the things that gives us evidence that we should have faith. But how do you think about that?
Well, I'm very pleased with the way this young generation is handling the situation. Mm-hmm. I think what they're saying, because my premise has always been we're going to have faith that it's going to get better. I think they're saying, no, it's not going to get better until we actually do something.
Right.
Rather than just having faith that it's somehow miraculously going to happen.
Yes.
And I'm so proud of this young generation and how they are pushing this movement. The reason we're here today is because of them.
That's right.
Because the reason things are changing, statues are coming down, governments are changing the debate is because of them. Mm-hmm. And that's a great thing to see. I think they've run out of faith, to be truthful. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So when we think specifically about the conversation here about abolishing the police department as we have it, or police reform, how are you thinking about this in your minds? And what implication is it having, as we think for young folk, how are their voices being represented in either of those models?
Well, I think my opinion about their voice right now is saying abolish the police department. And I think that's what you're hearing, you're seeing. I'm not sure that that's the way to go. I think there's some place in between that we can go. I think we need a viable police department that's going to serve and protect all of the citizens. Mm-hmm. We need a police department that we can hold accountable for every citizen. But we need a police department, so to speak. I think they have added fuel to the fire here that opens up the door that we can talk about police reform now, and it takes that. I think it has awakened the police department.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to comment on that?
I think it's a last-ditch union-busting effort.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I think it is a Hail Mary. I think it is a cry out of desperation. I think it is a weak move that you do when you don't know what else to do. I think it is a surface response for a deep, deep problem. I'm not saying that I think people are wrong to have the conversation. I'm saying that the conversation is deeper, okay? So it reminds me of, when we had the conversation back in the 90s about, you get stopped with cocaine versus you get stopped with crack. You remember that discussion? And, you got stopped with cocaine and you were getting, 3 days? You had crack, you were getting 3 years. And we all realized there's a racial disparity here.
That's right.
There's something wrong here. But what we did was we just gave everybody 3 days. We didn't give everybody 3 years. Why is that? Because we would rather risk the black community than have the deep conversation and potentially punish white people longer. We do the same with the discipline disparity in the schools. We realize that we're not suspending white kids and we are suspending black kids, so what do? We just say we're gonna stop suspending black kids. Why? Because we don't wanna have the conversation about suspending white kids. And so what I think we do is I think we look for short-term solutions, to your point, for long-term problems, and we end up doing more harm than good. And in my experience in going into classrooms and in going into schools, organizations, children, people, they like structure, they like order, they like clarity, they like to know that there is someone in charge, they like to trust the person that's in charge. We right now are facing a very leaderless situation with no structure and no authority. The students in my world right now, they're all over the place. All they know is what's happening right now isn't right. All they know is what's happening right now is they can't officially practice for athletics without somebody driving around and telling them to break it up because they're not practicing social distancing. But just across the freeway, there's over 600 people hanging out in a park that everyone is turning a blind eye to. They know something's not right about that. These young people know something's not right. They want us to get ourselves together.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very powerful. If we could see the world through their eyes and follow their lead, that would be terrific. Yeah.
The low-hanging fruit here is abolishing the police department. That's the easy, that's what you're saying. That's the easy thing that we can do. That's the low-hanging fruit. The hard work is to say, we're gonna hold the police department accountable. We're gonna hold the unions accountable to make it, to serve the public. That's hard work. It takes more time and effort to do. It's less exciting. It doesn't get the, all the applause, but that's where it's going to happen. I believe we need a police union, but we need a police union that will also call out bad police officers and not support bad police officers like we have now. We have a police union now that I think aids and abets a subculture of racism. It does. And so in doing that, I think we have to work hard to make sure that the union is functioning in the right way in helping, in helping and serving the public.
I can certainly appreciate the fact that the discussion of police reform, abandoning the police, really took off after George Floyd was killed. But obviously that conversation had been going on for a long time with those that wanted to see that happen. But I just, as an observation, how quickly those that are advocating that don't even talk about George Floyd anymore. And that really is what started this movement. And I really hope that we don't take a victory lap just for having done some sort of police reform and think that everything's okay, because everything is not okay. Everything is not okay at this point. I just saw, Terrein, you were talking about entrepreneurship. Just earlier this week, some real estate company said that the disparity between white and black home ownership is wider in Minnesota than it is in the United States.
Right.
So again, we have wider disparities, from achievement gaps to home ownership, to you look at incarceration rates. You see all of this, and so police reform is very important, but it's just really a piece of the puzzle.
I think it brings a lot of attention to what it looks like. What's the concept gonna look like? When we look at the stats, and there's 93% of the police that don't live within the city, that's an issue. They don't have no bond with the community. They're not in the inner cities. They're not at our community centers refereeing or coaching. They're not stopping in at these churches. They're not in a city. So then when they come to people they don't know, they already have a certain type of bias towards them. So we need to have more of a say, more Minneapolis people, police that live in Minneapolis need to police Minneapolis. And a second thing is that the conversation I'm having with a lot of people is, they pay taxes that fund the police, and on their way to pay those taxes, on their way to work, they're getting harassed. They're getting pulled over. But why them? Why in the city, but not as much in the other cities? So, like, what does that look like when we start to talk about defunding the police? Or does that mean that we're going to have unarmed police show up to non-violent cases or calls? Because that is the solution that I'll be for. If we had non-lethal weapon, non-lethal carrying officers responding to non-violent calls, I can get behind that. But defunding the whole police, that's a far push.
I'm reminded of that quote by Edward Deming: "Every system is designed to get the results it gets," and so I wonder about how the conversation about defunding isn't about getting to that core assumption that was made when policing started. I mean, policing is, I was born in '66, so, policing is the way that it is structured now is all I know. But it was rooted in marginalization of black folk, right? And so how does the accountability for that play out in just restructuring as opposed to abolishing, do you think?
I think it needs to look different. I mean, I think police got started, I'm not 100% sure, but I believe it got started when they had slaves, and they was out to round up slaves. We're not slaves anymore. So to have that same mentality when they're behind the police cars is not what needs, that's not the right mentality to have.
Yeah.
There needs to be a new mentality, a new way to police, and a better way to get that point across.
Melvin, in the city of Minneapolis, what are you hearing from business owners about accountability for the police currently?
Well, this is the first time I've heard this much from the business community about the need for some significant reform. There are certainly business groups that don't agree with defunding, but are on record saying that they definitely advocate a significant amount of reform, and I don't really know exactly where that line is. But I believe the business community is concerned about what the plan is, because there are expectations, I believe, of law enforcement for the safety of workers, of residents, and in my case, for visitors. And I would say candidly that since the discussion of defunding the police has hit the national media, we've had lots of conversations with our prospective customers about really what does that mean. And so we're continuing to have dialogue with our city council members to try to find out what that really does mean. We've met with a number of them and trying to get those answers. I think a lot of us would feel a little bit more comfortable if we understood exactly what that meant. So it looks like they're beginning to try to formalize and formulate and crystallize those plans. But to answer your question, the business community would like to know what that plan is, and understanding that that public safety is a big reason why we've been successful as a community.
And what would make me more comfortable, and people that I talk to and within my congregation, is if we had some type of plan coming from the mayor and the chief of police. I know where the council stand on this, and I know what they propose to do about this. But up to now, I haven't heard anything of what the plan is from the mayor and the chief of police. So when I'm debating with people who are saying abolish the police department, I have nothing to come forth with.
Sure.
And so I'm still waiting. What would be helpful for me, but I'm waiting for a plan from the mayor and the chief of what they propose that we would do in keeping the police department, and how would it look. We don't have that yet, but I think a whole lot of people, especially the business community, would feel more comfortable if they could hear that plan.
That's right.
I think I would add, especially onto what Terrein was saying. So if you look at it from a historical perspective, you would be hard-pressed to find any examples, ancient civilization up until now, where there is no public safety model, where there is no type of policing or enforcement. And even what history will tell us beyond America is that you can remove one and replace it with a different one, but you still run the same risks. You can still be in a similar position 10, 15, 20 years down the road. So I think that's kind of where my concern comes in is, are we just having this knee-jerk reaction? When I hear abolish or dismantle the police, what I choose to hear is the current policing system, not just in general, because there's nothing in history that would show us that we can in any way thrive without some sort of order and enforcement of law. Now, where our history is so rich and so pertinent, and I'll take advantage of us being in a church, and I'll take advantage of me having Reverend Gallmon to my left. But I just started John Wallace's book, America's Original Sin. And he opens it with, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." And his point is that America has not collectively known and spoken its truth. He also asserts that racism is America's original sin, that through the conquering of natives for the land, and then the enslavement of Africans to build the land, that is the basement, the foundation, that is the pillars that this house sits on. And so while we continue to fail to address that, confess it with our mouths, and then turn from it, we'll continue to reap the same harvest over and over again. And that we'll go a couple of generations and do okay, but then we'll be right in this same spot again. I think what I crave when it comes to our current policing system, I'm absolutely open to different conversations. Should we be doing things differently? Where is the truth? Where is the historical truth in the matter? Sheriffs were the original law enforcement of this land. Police departments were brought in, and there is a direct correlation with runaway slaves, right? There is a direct correlation with that. Are we being honest about that? Now, what I would assert is that similar to me walking through a school, why is it that I can go into one classroom, and all of you know this because you've either been in that classroom or you've had children, but why is it that I can go into one classroom and I can see kids that are disobedient, disrespectful, arguing with one another, and rude to the teacher, and I can change the teacher in that very class? Those kids are listening, attentive, respectful, and cooperating on a group project together. I changed one thing: the leader. That is my point about leaderlessness right now. Law enforcement in America, that's been cowboys for years, for generations. That's one of the most testosterone-driven, gum-chewing, sunglasses on the back of my head, my windows rolled down this much while I talk to you. It does not get much more cavalier than that. Right now, if you have a police department filled with rank and file cowboys, guess who they're following? Another cowboy.
Right.
That's all there is to it. We put people in positions of leadership who will go in and do what we say, but are they deeply, regardless of whether how kind, compassionate, and understanding they are they respected by their rank and file? If not, that's no different than that classroom with those kids that are out of control.
The truth-telling is a great point that helps us move forward also. Once the community, it helps build trust once we begin to tell truth. When I heard that the Civil Rights Commission is going to be investigating and that they were only going back 10 years, I almost fell off my chair. 10 years?
That's right.
We need to go back 30 years so that the truth is told, okay? 10 years is not going to reveal the truth about the Minneapolis Police Department. You go back 30 years and you start pulling up conversations and letters, you're going to know what the truth is. But 10 years, that's Minnesota nice, if you ask me, 10 years.
That's placating in a way to
Yeah, absolutely.
to the crowd. Yeah, I would agree. So with trust and healing, what do you think are some strategies that should be utilized by the police, by the mayor, to help build that trust with the community as we go through this?
We've heard the answer. You've got to admit that original sin. You've got to get to that point. I've seen so many examples just since George Floyd's killing of very well-meaning public and private entities wanting to do things, wanting to donate, wanting to write checks. But my fear is that we are going to feel good about ourselves and then not deal with the core issue. So that's where trust begins, is admitting the issue. And I'm not a native of Minnesota. I've been here 13 years, having moved here from Texas. And I have gotten to know about the Minnesota nice and wanting to avoid conflict. But somehow, at this moment in time, we are at a moment in time where we have the opportunity to really have these hard conversations. And it goes well beyond police reform, as I mentioned earlier. So admitting those original sins, that was a very good way that you framed that.
Thank you, Melvin.
And that's not easy. To have that conversation is going to be painful and it's going to hurt, but it needs to happen. And it needs to happen sooner than later, because once everyone understands that, they can tell that to someone else. They can have that conversation at their dinner table. They can have it at different places that were not having that conversation once it becomes more uniform or universal. But it needs to happen, and it needs to happen as soon as possible. Also, another way that can help bring trust is oversight. We need to start, especially in the inner cities, the business leaders and pastors and principals and business owners need to come together and host a meeting of what oversight looks like. What can we do to have oversight of the police, and how can that help bring trust back to the city? I think it would take having people like us in a room together, having a conversation about oversight and getting that going as soon as possible.
Like a civilian review board?
Oh, yes.
Right. And different tiers. If they don't meet their criteria, different tiers, then that money or that budget goes to different inner city schools. It goes to different inner city businesses or community centers. That's a lot of community centers that a lot of young people go to, that they can have all year round camps for coding and skills and skill placement and skill building to be able to invest in the community.
You know, I think about the education of police officers and how, again, sort of that is a pathway for the behavior that we're seeing. And yes, we need a strong leader, but we also need the practice of policing rooted in maybe different strategies. And I was talking to a friend recently who said, you know, she's working on her master's to be able to do counseling. And she said, you know, in addition to the bachelor's degree and then the 2 years master, you have to do a 1 year practicum. And so you're really investing a lot of time in order to actually even be of service to a person who has a need. What do you think about the kind of education that police are receiving, and is that something that we should be talking about also?
So I would say that I think there are 3 professions that I see very similarly: education, law enforcement, and medicine. And I see the overlap between those 3 because you are dealing with a human product. And we understand it in medicine. We understand that bedside manner. We understand that you need years of apprenticeship. We understand that you need a residency. We apply that well. You know, why is it that some doctors are able to, they have a gift. It's not technical. It's a gift. Just like, why can some people create this beautiful art? I can't do that. It's a gift. And we understand that in medicine, and we stoke that. We don't do that to that same degree in education and in law enforcement. I would also argue that education and law enforcement, unlike medicine, are very union heavy. Yeah. They have been very, and they've been union heavy for a reason. One, we could consider both of those very blue collar. Why is that? We've done that in America. We've made them blue collar. Medicine is not blue collar. So we've put them in that spot where they've been forced to unionize. A lot of their unionization has come around from poor working conditions. Okay, so it was birthed, a lot of their unionization was birthed in very relevant, credible reasons. But again, that unionization further blue collarizes them, right? And so to me, when I think about education or law enforcement, and I think about how we throw people into the field, unlike medicine, where we grow them up and we apprentice them, and they have this opportunity for residency, and we watch them practice, and then we go, you're not ready. We don't have that in education, and we don't have that in law enforcement. And I would argue those are 2 just as critical worlds as medicine is. For me, when I think about training for law enforcement, Derek Chauvin was a field training officer. He was an FTO. Why is that? He had 13 excessive force cases against him. He had 2 officer-involved shootings. Why was he on the books to train anybody? 2 of the officers that were on the scene were trained by him. There have been teachers I've said, you can't have a student teacher.
That's right.
I love you. You're not ready. You still need to hone your practice. I'm not putting a student teacher in your classroom. Check in with me next year. I understand what you're saying, Gloria, that there's things here, but leadership, to me, it continues to come down to courageous, passionate leadership. When I think about educators and teachers and how strong their unions are, and when I think about the opportunities that I've had to work with the teachers that I've worked with, the things that they're willing to do with me and for me that they don't necessarily always agree with, but they trust me because I don't lie. I tell the truth, and they know if I have to, I will put them on my back and walk over hot coals with them and for them. They go with the flow. They give me the benefit of the doubt. When I come into my schools, what do? We go into the community. We spend an entire day in the community. It's a work day. Go to Cub. Put some gas on your car on Penn and Lowry.
Yes.
Right?
That's right.
Walk up to the kids' houses. Eat breakfast at Milda's. Be seen, speak, and be spoken to. And these teachers that do it for the first time, And they're like, because they do drive in and drive out.
For sure.
And we know that. And guess what? The kids know it. They can smell it on you the second you walk in, just like with cops.
Exactly.
They know it the second you walk in. Do you see me or do you not see me?
Right.
And I would argue that the strongest police officers, including the one I'm married, are police officers that see us,
Right.
that walk in and see us and feel us and go to the churches and go to the schools and don't just go for a minute
Right.
to have their picture taken, but stay. And guess what? People tell them anything they want to know. People will call them and say, I can tell you exactly who it is, where they're at, what they did, and what they're driving.
That's right.
Because they trust them. When all this was going on, and my husband is retired, and he was being called by so many community members, can you come over, can you come over, can you come over? Because people felt like they needed to protect and patrol their own communities. Because it was very clear that the officers were not around. And he kept coming home each night, and he kept saying, you know what I would do right now? If I was in a car right now, if I was a commander right now, every one of these neighborhood leaders, block club leaders, patrol, they would be in a squad with a cop.
Right.
Every single one of them.
100%.
In the front seat. You're going everywhere together. We're talking. We're going to go to scenes together. We're going to stop at parks together. We're going to get to know each other.
Right.
There are things that can be done that would build trust and credibility, but there are not the people who are willing to make them be done right now.
Oh, it's almost like since the George Floyd thing and the calling for defunding, it's almost like the police are like, well, if that's what you want, this is what it looks like.
That's right.
And you know what I mean? They're like they're trying to show us like they have the right to be how they are. No, you don't have the right to be how you are. We want you. We need you. But we also need you to understand that you need to be more compassionate and have emotion and be more humane when you come into these cities and you pull people over and you talk to people. That's what we need. We need you to show your heart and to show that you are human and not just doing this as some type of adrenaline boost or anything like that. We need to know that you actually do care.
And that's that us versus them mentality.
Right.
And it's not everybody, but it's enough now. And that's my worst fear. My worst fear is that when school is going to start, my district terminated our contract with Minneapolis Police Department.
Okay.
So we do not have school resource officers. And even though the SRO in my building was amazing, an alumni, a member of the community, my head football coach, somebody who was able to stop things before they started, somebody who was able to stop it from even getting to a blue card number, somebody who was able to go get stuff before it escalated, walk people out of the building, be like, I got you, go find so-and-so's grandma before this gets worse, eat lunch with kids on a regular basis, hear about all the stuff. I mean, this man did amazing work, and it was painful to see his contract terminated. But my biggest fear is that the Minneapolis Police Department, rank and file, is so angry right now.
Yeah, 100%.
They are so angry right now, and though they may be angry with City Council, or though they may be angry with the Minneapolis Public School Board, guess who that anger is going to get taken out on? And that when school starts, and all this absolute wild, wild west that has been Minneapolis right now turns into school, I will be on my own, because if and when there's a problem, let them handle it.
Right.
They got this, right? They don't need us, right? Dismantle the police department, right? And so all of that anger towards maybe our elected or appointed officials are going to be brought down on those of us that are really trying to figure this thing out.
That's true. But when things like this happen, it leaves a void space. And right now, that void space could be occupied by coaches, pastors, barbers. You go into a barber shop, and they're like a therapist. Barbers, business owners, they can come together and they can they can get a plan going and revise something and get something that's safer than what it is now. Because people in the community, they trust the barbers, they trust the coaches. Kids, youth, they trust the coaches, they trust the teachers, they trust the business leaders. So they need to come together and fill that void that is absent right now.
Yeah, I think one of the things that your stories highlights for me is, like with kids, they need to know that you care. Otherwise, they know that you're just doing this for a paycheck, right? And so if police officers aren't in the community, if they don't really care to understand what the root issue is, people are not going to show them the respect, and they're going to be disruptive, and problems won't get solved. So, yeah, I think that is going to be one of the ways in which we have to reimagine how police officers can really be community members, which I think is what we're talking about.
Right, 100%.
And so when we think then about the vision for reform, one of the things that you talked about, Terrein, was having police respond without weapons for certain kinds of offenses, right?
Right.
How do the rest of you think about that?
No. I'm gonna need you to show up with something.
Okay.
Okay, I'm just being
That's
me.
cool.
I'm just being honest.
Yeah.
And maybe I need to think more, right? Maybe I need to grapple with that more. But my gut reaction, just in some of the situations that I've managed, and I think about even running a classroom or running a school, really 2 to 4% of your school gives you 90% of your problems.
Mm-hmm.
You guys remember that. I know I'm not the only one. You remember
right.
that, right? And so you need people to really not take out their anger and frustration on 90% of the school, but understand who the 2 to 5% are and work with that 2 to 5%, right? I think my concern, my fear is that maybe eventually we could get to that point. Mm-hmm. But I worry that right now, at least what I feel like I'm in the midst of, some of the stuff that I feel like I'm trying to manage. I need you to know. Now I will say this. This is something that I say all the time. My family's so tired of hearing about it. I don't even know that I would have a problem with lethal force if it was applied equally. I'm being serious. Yeah. If just as many, I mean, how many of us have seen image after image, video after video of some white man that has lost his mind, it is armed, is completely irresponsive to command and control, and he is still alive to talk about it. And so I think for me, the issue, it goes back to like, what's deeper?
Yes.
Why are you unable to keep your hand off that gun in different situations? What does that bring up in you? What have we been poisoned by? I remember the Seattle Black Police Officers Association came out with a blog that was so interesting. They said, we did these simulations and we found that we were just as quick to pull the trigger as our white officers when they were doing these virtual realities, and the suspect was in a hood and the suspect turned around and they were upfront and honest. What poison have we been drinking ourselves in America under this original sin that causes us to pull that trigger quicker when that face that turns around is black? And so I see not being, having guns, not being armed as an option, but I see it as, again, a short-term solution rather than asking that deeper, harder question, but why? Right. Why can you show up on a white scene and everybody can still be living and breathing after that, but you can't show up on a black one and have everyone survive?
Thank you. That is very powerful truth-telling. Mm-hmm. And we know it. And I think that is exactly what people are starting to grapple with and ask themselves, why is that? and on an individual level. Yeah, I think that that's right. When we think about the business community, back to you, Melvin, and how they're imagining reform, de-escalation of issues outside of businesses, people loitering on the street, how are you thinking about that?
I frankly have a somewhat of a conflicted view. Obviously, what I do for a living is to make sure I am able to authentically represent all the assets that our city has for visitors,
Yes.
and we have a lot to offer. So we've been very successful bringing major events here, et cetera. But I'll just say I've been in conversations of business leaders and speaking of how to protect downtown as the crown jewel, so to speak. I've heard some leaders, names you would know, suggest that we need to make, say, the north side more appealing so black young men won't want to come downtown. I've been in those conversations. And what's so shocking is that I'm the only one in the room that thinks there's a problem with that conversation. So I live in a world where I'm being judged by how well I do in terms of our organization bringing in conventions and
Yes.
visitors and economic impact. So I understand the need to have a viable product downtown to sell. But when there are those in leadership positions that have that type of feeling, that type of animosity towards young black males, it's very disturbing. It's very disturbing.
It's deep-seated.
Yes.
Yeah, and holding up a mirror is a hard thing to do
Yes.
in that situation. Thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate
I
it.
think one of the ways that we can avert that is the police department needs to do a better job, in my opinion, of screening applicants. In my opinion, a police department is attracted to sociopaths. And so they are drawn to the police department. And then you put a gun on them and a badge on them, and
Right.
you know, it's all over.
It's a recipe for disaster.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So somehow they need to do a better job of screening, number one. But number two, I think where these individual officers come from matters. If you're from a town where you are not involved in any diversity at all, and you find yourself in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where there is diversity, I don't think you know how to act. You've never had that experience before, other than what's been told to you and what's been indoctrinated to you. So that's and you act toward African American males in that way. You know, it is me against them. And so we need a better job of we need better training, and we need better screening.
And then accountability to the standards
Correct.
that are applicable to all folk, not just black men, youth, etc.
And I think that's what would be most critical for me, because again, I see the comparison to education. You know, and I've been burned where I have a candidate in front of me who looks like my kids, came from the same neighborhood as my kids. I'm like, oh my gosh, I've hit the jackpot, and they come in and stink up the joint. Right? Because
Yeah.
I made an assumption that simply because they had an intimacy and a familiarity with North Minneapolis or with Minneapolis as a city or with being a person of color, that they would automatically know how to teach. That's not always true. So again, yes, right, the onboarding process, the screening process, but the continued leadership process. Are you, after action, reviewing with everyone? Are you having conversations? Are you having those hard, courageous, confrontational conversations? Are you, as leaders, out in the community? Are you riding in squads? Are you giving feedback when you get back into the squads? Because I've also had the opposite happen, where I've had somebody fresh off some small town, northern Minnesota, and I'm desperate, so I got to take them. And I'm watching every minute of it, and they're amazing because they are pure of heart, and the kids sense it, and they feel it as soon as they walk in the room. And they're eating out of the palm of that person's hand.
Yes.
But again, it takes ongoing leadership and accountability.
Thank you. So I recognize that we all sit in organizations where we have the ability to influence and convene. What might we do? I think about the Women's Foundation of Minnesota. We're investing in young women who are really at the front lines. That's one of the ways that I think about how I can continue to give voice and seed that innovation and amplify their voices to make sure that they're at the table when we're talking about these things. As we wrap up, is there one thing that you would like to do from where you sit to help create a vision for police reform that is more equitable and just?
Well, I think it starts with the coalition of all the minorities, the Black and inner city, women, LGBT, Latinos, the Hmongs, all of them. We all need to come together and have an equal, powerful voice. If we can all come together and make inroads on that, I think that would do great improvement a lot faster than how it's happening as of right now.
Awesome.
I would say that during this transition period, reform, abolish, I'm not exactly sure where we're going to end up. I am concerned that our existing police officers are discouraged or maybe angry, and not all police officers are bad. We gotta
Yes.
admit that. We gotta definitely keep that in mind. And something as simple as thanking a cop these days goes a long way. I did that at this Target down on Nicollet a couple of weeks ago to two young officers, and you would have thought I gave them a $100 bill. They were just so thankful for that. So an acknowledgement that during this transition, we still need them.
Thank you.
We desperately need them. So
Thank
I
you.
think that is something that we need to be reminded of.
I think the city needs to expect the Minneapolis Police Department to have that truth-telling and to build up their own internal capacity so that they have a strong pipeline of leadership and accountability that feeds and builds up the good and starves out the bad.
Very well said. Thank you.
I belong to a group called the Downtown Clergy, and one of the things that we're looking at is putting together forums where people can come together and just talk about the issue. There's no political agenda. Just sit down and let's talk. And I don't think we do enough of that in Minneapolis. Just sit down and just share with one another.
Well, that is well said and a lovely way to wrap up this opportunity that I've had to talk with you. So thank you so much. Thank you to Westminster Town Talk. Thank you, Melanie, for the opportunity. Really appreciate being here.
Thank you to each of our panelists and to you for joining us tonight. We hope you mark your calendar for Thursday, August 6th at 7 p.m. for the next Town Talk and a panel discussion on racial trauma and mental health. Be well, be safe, be good to each other. Good night.